Okay, so Brian, I got to ask you. We are, the work of just man is done by others. You know the saying, and
Yes, sir.
we planned this in advance, and literally minutes before we went on air, we have this update coming out of every single possible outlet, talking about the fact that the Israelis have decided that they will respond and they will respond. I'm going to read to you the actual. It's from Unusual Whales on Twitter. I don't know if you follow them, but they're pretty credible.
Okay.
And so, just in the Israeli War Cabinet just decided to retaliate clearly and forcefully against the missile and drone attack carried out by Iran Saturday. The Times of Israel has reported. And then I'm pulling up another report from a local Israeli outlet that says that there's only two caveats is about the two caveats will be one, that it would not start a regional war, and two, that it would be acceptable from the US side. So essentially they're saying we're not going to go rogue and we're not going to go overboard, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of political theater here, Tom, as you know. Thanks for having me back on. Great to be back. The U.S. and the U.K. and the other allied forces, which happily appear to be including Saudi Arabia and Jordan and others, they clearly know that there's no universe in which Israel does not respond to Iran's unprecedented attack attempt the other night. And so, yes, they're all publicly saying that they don't want to start a regional war, and they don't. And it's a responsible thing for adult nations to do, to not want to start a regional war. But they know Iran's going to go. NSC spokesman Kirby said that twice yesterday morning on the talk shows, that Netanyahu's the elected leader of Israel and he's got to do what's right for his people, and that's up to them. So everyone knows it's going to happen. One of the things they're trying to do, though, is maintain a level of tactical surprise. There's no strategic surprise here. Iran knows they're going to get hit, but the when and the how are what you want to try to keep secret. And so Israel's response does not have to be within a certain time period after the Iranian attacks. I think it's pretty likely to happen during the night in the next couple of days, but it could take a week, it could take a month, and there's nothing actually terribly wrong with that, because now you get to keep the mullahs guessing every night and wondering if a missile is going to drop on their head.
So that brings me to my next question, which I wanted to ask you. Do you think that what was the intention? We're talking a lot about the capabilities, right? What was the intention of the Mullah regime when they launched the attack? Was it were they fully intent on causing harm, or were they trying to essentially do a poor job? I'll give you an example. It's like when my wife asks me to do the dishes, and I really do it badly, so she never asks me again.
Yeah.
Is that the theater we've been seeing here, or is it actually they try
Like
to cause some damage?
Tom Sawyer with the fence painting, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Look, I think clearly, well, I shouldn't say clearly. I'm not an expert in the Iranian regime, and we should make it clear that
Who is?
we have nothing against the people of Iran. It's the regime, the horrible Islamist regime that controls them. But so I don't have insight into their brains. Okay, no one does. But did you lose me?
I think on my end, my internet went on
Yeah, I
the
saw
fritz.
the screen spinning there.
No, it wasn't your fault. It was my fault.
Okay. Well, anyway, so
My end.
what I was saying is I don't have any real insight into how the Ayatollahs think. And of course, that's one of the limitations of any intelligence service in the world. What the main thing our intelligence services measure, and this is, I'm mentioning this because I think there was a lot of back and forth. How much did we know? How much didn't we know? We measure capabilities and we measure movements. And so we knew, Western intelligence knew, and I'm sure Israel knew, that the launchers were moving days before the Iranian attack. That there was signals intelligence that I'm sure indicated they were getting ready to do something. But number one, we can't know the intentions of, in this case, the mullahs until they know themselves. And even if we had the best sources in the world, and I don't think they knew themselves up until the last minute. And the other thing is, if we did know the intentions because we have a human source or because we have a penetration electronically, we would never talk about that publicly. We probably would have talked about it with Israel, but never publicly. So to directly answer your question, I think they had two goals. I think one was the domestic political audience. They had to show that they were doing something directly against Israel, given the way they spun their own people up internally. I also think they definitely wanted to test the ability of Israel and the coalition to repel a massive, 300 projectile at simultaneous attack, and also to test whether the West, the United States, the UK, and whether the Saudis and Jordanians and others would actually defend Israel. But they launched, I don't know, I'm not a defense spending expert, but must have been billions of dollars worth of ordnance at Israel. And I don't think they did it without the intent to cause harm. I think they didn't want to kill a lot of civilians. I think they wanted to strike military facilities, and I think they just got beat. So I don't think it was a fake at all. I don't think it was theater.
Do you think, obviously, in the equation of warfare, defense is 10 times more expensive, right? So these drones, I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're essentially mopeds.
Yeah.
Mopeds with they call them actually mopeds. That's the nickname because they fly at about like 80 miles, and it's just basically a moped engine with some wings and an explosive.
It's super slow. Yeah.
Super slow, but when you swarm, they're very effective. As you've seen in the Aramco explosion, they're very effective when you just swarm and oversaturate the defense system. But in warfare, right, defense is always 10 times more expensive. To shoot down a rocket that's a ballistic missile or a cruise missile, ballistic missiles going in I don't know how many Machs, but it's like beyond the speed of sound. And you need to pinpoint, shoot it down. So that's way more expensive than the rocket itself. So I'm saying, right, Iran spent a lot of money, right? Israel spent, I'm sure, a lot of money on that night. Do you think Israel made money that night with the exceptional capability of what the defense systems have done?
Well, two things I would say about that. One is you're historically right about the cost of defense over offense. And it's true, not just monetarily, right? The old joke is that the solution to a 10-foot fall is a wall is an 11-foot ladder. It's always easier to adapt to a new defense. But I believe that's about to change because of the UK development of the directed energy defense weapons and Israel's development of them too. So essentially they're lasers. And I think I read somewhere, this is more your area than mine, but that the cost of taking down an incoming rocket or missile will drop from, I'm making these numbers up, but something like, $40, $50, $60, $80,000 per rocket to like 10 cents per rocket. So that's going to make a huge difference. But secondly, to your question, I do think every country in the world now that thinks they have a missile drone threat problem is knocking on the door of the defense industry in Israel and in the United States to the extent that we collaborated on that. So yeah, I think they've clearly shown themselves the leader in the world at this in combination with their allies. And this is really the largest, I think, swarm cruise missile, ballistic missile attack in human history. So, they're 1-0 in defending against it. So right now they're the leaders. Absolutely. And I think people are knocking on their door.
I'm going to bombard you with a lot of questions because I have so many. I hope we can make
Sure.
as much as we can in an hour. On the eve of the attack, President Biden was on TV saying "don't," in that famous "don't," and then the Iranians do. Does it teach us anything about the U.S. deterrence in 2024 versus what it was, let's say, even 15 years ago?
Yeah, I think our deterrence is dramatically weaker than it was certainly when I served in the government and under Clinton and Bush. And I think that's no one president's fault. There's a huge political fight, obviously, in the United States now. The MAGA people want to blame Biden and the Democrats want to blame Trump. Really what it is a combination of things over the last 20 years. And I start with when Barack Obama swore publicly multiple times that a red line in Syria was going to be when they used chemical weapons against their own people. And he sent, I don't usually say this because I don't like John Kerry, but he sent poor John Kerry around the world to convince the rest of the world that a military strike would be good. And then, like, literally hours before, he just says, never mind. I took a walk in the Rose Garden with my national security advisor. We're not doing that. And then you had on the Trump side, the complete, art of the deal capitulation to the Taliban in Afghanistan. People remember that Biden executed that withdrawal disastrously, which he did, and I criticized him for. But it was Trump that went hat in hand to the Taliban and made that deal for the U.S. to retreat from the region. Then you had the strike on Qasem Soleimani by Trump, which I approved of and said so publicly at the time. And then within weeks, they were attacking our bases again, and we did nothing. And now you have the Biden administration that is saying the right words, but some would say not backing them up with enough action, unless we're also doing things covertly that the world doesn't know about. And I hope we are. I mean, clearly Iran could have fired a lot more ordnance in a lot more lethal way had they wanted to. Now, again, I don't think it was theater. I think they did intend to hurt Israel physically inside their country, but they certainly didn't use anything close to their full capability. So I think they have been deterred a little bit. I think if the U.S. Navy and U.S. Air Force weren't in the region, they'd be doing a lot more.
So my question to you, you nailed the point I was making next. When I look at Iran, they don't have that long range capability to really, really hurt the Israelis. But when you put Hezbollah into that equation, they've got a lot of hurt in the arsenal, right?
Yeah.
So Hezbollah can, 150,000 precision missiles. They're right across the fence, and they know exactly where everything is. So Hezbollah can cause a lot of damage. So why do you think Iran didn't deploy Hezbollah into this attack?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One is what I said a minute ago, which is they portrayed the Israeli strike in Damascus to their own people as a strike on Iranian soil, which it was not. That facility clearly was not a consulate. You can't make something into a consulate by hanging a flag out a window. But that's what they sold their people internally that it was. So they then set up this honor code situation. I'm using that as a layman. I don't know anything about Shia Islam. That they sort of had to try to strike back on Israeli soil as in their view, retribution. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I believe since October 7th, that the IRGC and the mullahs view Hamas as completely expendable. I think they sent Hamas in there promising they would have their backs, and they never had any intention of having their backs. Hezbollah is another story. I think Hezbollah is the crown jewel of their proxy forces, more than Hamas, more than the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. And so you can only fire that weapon once, because I can promise you the Israeli government would like nothing better than an excuse to wipe out Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And then you're triggering a Lebanese civil war, which probably doesn't turn out well for Iran either. So I think they could have used their proxy forces, and I guess the Houthis did one or two launches, but I don't think they want to play all their cards on that one day.
Before we continue, a few housekeeping items. I'm enjoying this a lot. I don't know if you noticed. I'm thinking a lot of you are enjoying, because YouTube keeps sending us new viewers. We started with 150 viewers. Within 12 minutes, we are up to 1,400 viewers,
Amazing.
Which is a new record for this channel. So I think people are enjoying. The algorithm is really good at knowing if people are enjoying the show. If you are enjoying the show, don't donate. Don't send us any money. We're both fine. We don't need donations. The only thing I ask of you is go follow Bryan on X, Twitter, whatever you still call it, at Denver Cunning. The ticker is, sorry, the ticker. The handle is on the screen right now, and his name on the screen. So please go give Bryan a follow. Trust me, if you are interested in this topic, you will not regret it. He slowly developed into the best Twitter Spaces host. Started off absolutely as a horrible host. And within a couple of weeks, he went all the way to the top. My favorite Spaces on the top.
Well, thank you. Well, I had a good coach, so thanks.
I don't even take credit for that. Magnum Opus says this show deserves many more viewers, and I agree. The way you can help the show get more viewers is you can like the stream, and you can share it on social media. Then the algorithm will send us more viewers. So if you would like to help us, you can. Now, going back to the show from the housekeeping items, So what you're saying essentially, if I understand you, is you're basically saying, well, Hezbollah is single use, right? It's kind of like this old ass shotgun. You have one bullet, it's going to take out a rhino, but you just can fire it once, right? So once they use it, whatever happens, happens. But it's the end of their ability to have leverage over the Israelis. And I agree with you. I think they want that leverage all the way until the 1 minute before they get a nuke. At the point where Iran has a nuke, I think Hezbollah has no existence for the Iranians, at least. I don't know how they're going to do this, but Hezbollah with an Iranian nuke is pointless. Maybe as a belt and suspender system. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. A couple things. One is that there's a huge difference between having enough enriched uranium to produce a weapon like, what we did in the Manhattan Project, and having any ability to deliver that weapon. So I looked this up today. The current estimates are that and this is very murky. We got it wrong in Iraq twice, so in opposite sides. So I don't want to be putting too much stock in it, but the estimates are that Iran probably has enough enriched uranium that they could produce 1 to 3 weapons in 3 to 6 weeks. That seems a little optimistic to me. But even if they do that, they still have to get the device to Tel Aviv or Haifa or somewhere. And what separates, kind of a world-class nuclear power from a non-world-class nuclear power is the ability to miniaturize all that and put it into a missile or other delivery system. And who knows if Iran has that. So I'm not sure what the status is. But to get to your question, I think even once they have it, they would almost have to do some kind of demonstrable public test to show the world that they have it. And after that, they would have to use one of their 1 to 3 weapons to do the test. And then they would still have to calculate that if they actually use one of their weapons, even once they have them, that's it. They will cease to exist. And so it becomes, yes, they're much stronger and more powerful and dangerous once that happens. But I still think they are going to feel like they need proxies, just like the US and the Soviet Union used proxies all through the Cold War because nobody wanted to push the button.
So on that note, since World War II, we have not seen anybody deploy any sort of nuclear weaponry, not even the tactical nuclear weapons, because the clear understanding of all rational players is that the use of nukes leads to the destruction of the world. Eventually, the equation is quite simple. Einstein once said, the World War III is going to be fought with nukes, World War IV is going to be fought with sticks.
Yeah.
Is Iran, in your opinion, you former CIA, you've been in the White House, they know your name, they know who you are. So, in your opinion, do you think Iran in 2024 is the Mullah regime a rational player? Which means, basically, I'm asking, if they have a nuke, will they fall in line with the same logic we've seen since 1945?
Well, if you indulge me, just a quick personal story. So I'm a little bit older than you, and I was 15 years old when President Carter sent American helicopters and commandos into Iran to try to rescue the 400 plus hostages. What's the current regime in Iran? That was what they did in their first 4 hours of existence. That was like their first official act once they took over, was to storm the U.S. embassy, which actually was an embassy, ironically, and kidnap all of our people. That's a very well-known story. On the morning when the so-called Desert One operation literally crashed and burned in the desert in Iran, I came down the stairs and my mom was in tears because she thought that the U.S. was going to be at war and they were going to reinstate the draft and all of her sons would be heading off to fight Iran. So almost on that day, within days of that, I decided to try to go into the intelligence services or the foreign services of the U.S. because I didn't think I had really the skill set to join the military, although I have actually tried to a couple times since, proving I don't have the skill sets to join. So my point is, I've been watching the Iranian regime for my entire adult life. Not that I'm an expert. I don't speak Farsi or anything like that. And it's always extremely dangerous to try to export our Western way of thinking things to another culture. Having said all that, I just think if there's any rationality at the senior leadership of the Iranian regime, and I think you have to say there is, because otherwise they wouldn't do things like launch 300 projectiles instead of 3,000. They have to know as I said, that they use a nuclear weapon once and they will literally be wiped off the face of the earth. So I'm not, I would much rather have them not have a weapon. And I think if the US and or Israel get credible intelligence that they're right about to have it and there's a way to stop it militarily, we should. But I also don't think it's quote unquote the end of the world if they do get one. I mean, after all, India and Pakistan have had nuclear weapons for decades, and they fight border wars all the time. And arguably, Pakistani regimes have been as unstable and
Yep.
incompatible with Western ways of thinking as Iran.
Yeah. Well, the strongest argument I've heard so far, the one I thought about also was the one you mentioned, is like this would have been a good time to present irrationality in what happened. And as crazy as this was, it was a wild move, but the way they telegraphed it in advance and the scale of it and the way they played it out seems to me like they're more logical than they want us to think. But like you mentioned, in this part of the world, who knows, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and of course, the real risk is miscalculation, right? Because
yep.
if you're, in fact, Malcolm Nance, who comes on our show quite a bit,
I
he
love him.
was actually serving on a U.S. naval vessel during, I think, the first Gulf War. So in the late 80s, early 90s, when Iran did launch a cruise missile at what looked like at Israel, going right over the American ships. And he said, never have a bunch of sailors prayed so hard that there was a high explosive round on that missile, because if it would have been chemical or biological or nuclear, we would be living in an entirely different world. But the problem is, unless you have very advanced intelligence, which the US and Israel does, but even then, if there are enough numbers of ballistic missiles coming in, you don't know for sure what warheads are on those missiles. So it could be a miscalculation by an Iranian military person, it is miscalculation by an Israeli military person. After all, Iran's already shot passenger airlines out of the sky by mistake, as unfortunately have we.
By
So
the way, as
that's
the
what I,
Israelis, if you know the story about the Libyan flight
yeah,
they shot out accidentally in Egypt.
yeah. So
Everybody
that,
has bad history with civilian flights.
yeah. So that's what I really worry about, is a
Yeah.
miscalculation.
So obviously, when we're dealing with the weapons of this magnitude, one little mistake, you never know. You ride the lightning, you never know how this ends. I agree. So I want to ask you the next question. Um, so now that this has happened, do you think that the Israelis are out of the doghouse from a PR perspective? Because before the strike, the consensus was very negative, right? Post the attack, it seems like the consensus has flipped, the narrative flipped. Obviously, not on the fringe, but as far as kind of the base, the democratic base, it seems like it's less anti-Israel right now after what happened. And will the Israelis lose it if they retaliate?
Uh, yeah, I don't think they'll lose it if they retaliate, because I don't think they're going to launch a strike that's going to kill, hundreds or thousands of Iranian civilians. I just don't think that's going to happen, unless again something goes wrong and a weapon goes awry and goes somewhere it wasn't supposed to. I think, as you suggest, there's, unfortunately, tens of millions of people, probably at least millions, in the Western countries that are just not going to have their mind changed. They think what they think. They're either pro, in their view, Palestinian, or they're pro-Israeli, and nothing's going to change their mind. But there are a lot of people in the middle, and I think that the fact that Israel was subjected to this massive attempted attack, and by the way, the fact that nothing got through, or almost nothing got through, doesn't change the magnitude of the attack. Again, Iran, it's an act of war. Whatever had happened on October 7th or any time before or after, what they did 2 nights ago was an act of war. So the fact that the defense, won, if you want to look at it that way, and most of the ordnance didn't get through, that doesn't let Iran off the hook for the magnitude and scale of the attack. And I think much of the world does feel that tips the balance a little bit back in favor of Israel at the moment. The other thing it does is it creates essentially a second front. So that's a bad thing in a way for Israel, but also it's a lot for the IRGC to manage. What is going to happen in Rafah? When are they going to go into Rafah? How does that compare with what they might do to us? So there's a possibility that Israel and their allies could use the fact that there's multiple things going on now to no pun intended, kill a couple birds with one stone. I wonder if I lost you.
No, I'm still here, but
Oh,
my
good.
camera's on the fritz.
I
So
was
I'm gonna
afraid
keep
I was
asking you
talking to
questions.
myself.
No, I was hearing you and I was troubleshooting as I'm trying to solve my camera problems, but I'm still audible, which is the most. You're the guest, not me. So I'll keep you on solo view until I figure it out.
Well, you're prettier, but that's fine.
Oh, thank you, sir. But it's a matter of opinion, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So next question. So we talked about the fact that what the PR looks like, and I agree with you. My next question to you is going to be a hard one. The Israelis obviously will not go. Look, very low probability they'll go rogue for a multitude of reasons. We'll talk about it later if needed. But what? So if the equation is harsh response minus not start regional war minus acceptable on this administration, what possible scenarios do you see fitting into this equation?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me approach it two ways. First, under the laws of armed conflict, which I am an expert, and then more tactically, which I'm slightly less, well, somewhat less of an expert. So, under the laws of armed conflict, as I said, regardless if nothing had happened before 2 or 3 nights ago, Iran has committed acts of war against Israel. And whether Israel chooses to declare war on the Iranian regime like they did on Gaza, that's an internal sort of political decision. I suspect they won't because it's diplomatically, there's a lot of implications to that. But they are entitled now, under the laws of armed conflict, Israel is, to strike back. I don't call it retaliation because retaliation is not actually a thing that's allowed under the laws of armed conflict. What they will be doing, I think but if or when they strike back, is attempting to, one, degrade the capability of Iran, physically degrade it to doing something like that or something worse to them again. So destroying missile launchers, destroying command and control centers, destroying communications networks if they can find them, that literally will tactically hurt the military's ability to do this again. That's one set of targets. The other set of targets is what I would call more strategic deterrence to your back. And the strategic deterrence, I think, is more important here. And what that is striking targets that the IRGC and the regime hold particularly dear and important. And to be clear, under the laws of war, Israel does not have to respond proportionally in the way that people always tend to want to use that term. When you're attacked, the laws of war say that you are permitted to select acceptable military targets, legitimate military targets. They do not have to be the same kind of targets that your enemy tried to hit in your country. So it doesn't have to be, Israel firing 300 projectiles back at population centers in Iran. That would be equal. It doesn't have to be that. So what I think they should do, and then we can talk about what they maybe will do. I think target number one should be all facilities that they can find that produce drones. Full stop. That also, by the way, is a twofer because it helps Ukraine as well. Not that that's Israel's problem, but we're a coalition, so I think that would be very, very, very smart. Second thing is, and this is controversial in the Biden administration, but I'm totally comfortable with it as under the laws of war. Any facilities that create, transport, or use or provide fuel for all of these missile and rocket systems. So oil refineries, perfectly legitimate target as far as I'm concerned. I know the Biden administration doesn't want Ukraine striking those, but I think it's perfectly fine in Russia, and I think it's perfectly fine in Iran. And then the real question becomes, if you're going to do strategic deterrence, if you're not just going to strike military facilities, but also infrastructure that supports the war, do you include their nuclear program in that? Now, part of me says every president since at least Clinton, certainly a lot of time spent on this in the Bush administration when I was there, has been publicly and privately committed to stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, just like obviously Israel and other countries are. But they've all gone about it in different ways, and I don't think anyone has been successful at fully shutting down the program. Probably Stuxnet delayed it for a very long period of time. So now the question is, if you could make a significant dent in the capabilities, including, by the way, the scientists themselves that run the nuclear program for Iran, that would be a win. But that's a whole different weapon set. You got to have bunker buster bombs that can go hundreds of feet below the surface. And it's probably impossible to get everything, even if you try that. So I think I don't want to trivialize it by betting, but if I were going to say, I think it's about 5% possibility they'll hit nuclear weapons facilities. And I think there's 30 to 40% chance they'll hit other infrastructure targets. And I think they will certainly strike at the military capabilities that were used to try to attack them.
So that's a great answer. And by the way, right on time, we just hit 2,000 concurrent viewers on this stream.
Welcome, everybody.
We have never had these numbers here before. I think max we had like 200 with you last time.
Oh,
so it's
amazing.
10 times more.
Great.
I hope everybody is following you on X. So now the next question. Given what we're talking about here right now, Iran has basically went from having capabilities to having intentions to acting on those intentions.
Yep.
Is the Iranian nuclear bomb back on the global agenda or not after what happened? Because they kind of threw it out. Is the Iranian nuclear thing a global problem now again?
I wouldn't say it ever went off the agenda. I think, actually the combination. So I think I was very much against the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear program under the Obama administration. And then I was generally supportive of most of the measures that Trump took. And then I was against the Obama administration trying to somehow rework the JCPOA. But the irony here is between President Obama and President Trump and President Biden, they all made different decisions and they combined to be the worst possible combination of decisions you could have. Let me explain what I mean by that. Once you had the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, even though I was opposed to it, you did have IAEA inspectors in there. You did have cameras in there. You did have limitations on the amount of products that they could receive. And not enough. I don't think they were ever going to stop, but I do think it slowed them down. Then Trump came in and he said, forget that. We're going to knock that whole program down. We're going to put maximum sanctions on. At which point Iran said, okay, now the deal's broken. We're going to go full speed ahead and make whatever we want. And I don't think the Trump sanctions changed that. So I'm sure they made a lot of progress during Trump. And then Biden comes back in and does the opposite again. So I think the combination has been terrible. And they're much closer to a nuclear weapon than they needed to be. I think I didn't answer your question. I forgot what the question was. What was the question?
The question was, but you gave me a good recap of something that I'm wondering about. And sadly, you confirm my fears. So my question was, with how the Iranian nuclear problem has taken a back seat to other things, is given what the world have seen, especially countries like Saudi Arabia, who's looking at this, and the UAE, and Saudi Arabia has clout with the US, right? Is now a good time to start pushing this from their perspective back to the global agenda?
Yeah, so you nailed it. I don't think anything that's happened in the last 6 months has changed the view of the Netanyahu administration, which I think is clearly, if they ever have a credible chance to destroy the program, they will. Or the Biden administration's view, which is, hey, we don't want them to have nuclear weapons, but we also want them to, be more civilized in their behavior and come into the community nations and all that kind of UN bullshit talk. But what I think has changed is just what you said, is I think the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians and others now are going to be much more, make a lot more efforts to try to convince the United States to not get in their way of having nuclear weapons, which of course is the scariest outcome of all, right? That you have Iran and the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Indians and the Pakistanis and other countries in the region all having nuclear weapons. So I think it's a very, very dangerous time. And I'm sure there's a lot of diplomacy. And, one element of diplomacy is bribery with money to try to get the Saudis in particular to focus on the Abraham Accords, focus on the great economic arrangements that we can make, and put the nuclear weapons capability to the side. But I'm sure that the Saudis in particular, and probably the Egyptians too, any requests they have for more advanced American weapons that are not nuclear, I think they'll get. F-35s probably even.
That's the bribery they give Erdogan in Turkey for accepting Sweden and Finland.
And I think that was worth it, even though I can't stand Erdogan. Yeah. I think that was definitely worth it.
Well, he has. Look, I can't stand him either, but he has. He's the only one with an actual legit military. in the region and maybe even globally. He has, with the exception of the United States, he has the biggest military, right, in the world.
It depends on how much you think the Russian forces have been attrited, but it certainly isn't as big as PRC. I
Okay,
don't
so
think. I
he's
haven't looked it
definitely
up.
the king of the hill in the region,
That's right. Yeah, I think that's
and
right.
he sits on the passageway, so he can close the gate at any time.
Oh yeah. I would not want to play poker with him. He has taken what could have been seen as a pretty weak hand and made the most of it, for
Well,
sure.
he's economically he's in deep doo doo.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've been following. Turkey is falling apart, and he made it
Uh,
happen. By the way,
yeah, yeah. That's a tragic story because I think
eighty
Turkey
percent
was.
inflation. 80% inflation. They have like 60% interest right now, or 45% interest, and it's
Jeez.
not working. So yeah, he's in deep trouble. But yeah, so next question I want to push here. So is Iranian attack on Israel brings the Abraham Accords closer after the Gaza PR nightmare f- put the countries further apart? Did the Iranians did a huge favor to the Saudis
One
to allow them
thousand
to?
percent.
Okay, can you
One
explain on that?
thousand percent. And I don't know if yours is a family show or not, so I'll not say what I could say, but this will be the greatest strategic screw you to Iran in history. It's just exactly parallel to Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine, thinking he was going to shrink NATO, and the exact opposite happened. So I think yes, I think. I mean, absent some very unforeseen event, I think Saudi will join the Abraham Accords, and good on them that they're going to punish Iran that way. It's also in their interest too. They were about to do it before the attack. I think that's a major reason for Iran sanctioning the attack by Hamas, was to try to derail Abraham.
Yeah, well, obviously, interest-wise, they should be in bed because it makes perfect sense, and it makes perfect sense for the U.S. because the U.S. has no desire to stay active in the region, and if they can build that alliance, they can remote control the entire Middle East and not spend
Yeah.
a dime. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to do a space sometime soon on the concept of a Middle East NATO for the Middle East. I don't know if it actually works, but I think it's worth a discussion.
Well, we've seen a small taste of it on the Iranian attack, if the
Yeah,
Middle East aerial
exactly.
defense with
Yeah.
Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the Israelis, with the help, obviously, of the United States and NATO forces.
And by the way, Tom, people will see me. I talk a lot about people that kind of know what they're doing are playing 3D chess. And a lot of these armchair generals on X and with podcasts, not you, are just kind
I'm
of
not a
playing.
general.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, it's an armchair general.
I state right away, I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
Fair
That's a disclaimer.
enough. But so I think a lot of these commentators are basically playing checkers. When I talk about 3D chess, what I mean by that is, well, I mean a lot of things, but one of them is there's a lot of things that are happening in the world that aren't classified. They're not secret per se, but most people aren't aware of. And one of the biggest ones is that United States Central Command, CENTCOM, which is our combatant command for the Middle East, is unique in that it is extremely closely coordinated with Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Emirates, so that all this speculation about, did Israel know what was coming and not tell the US? Did the US know and not tell Israel? That's ridiculous. There are command centers in, undisclosed locations where all these countries are sitting there together sharing intelligence. And that's one of the big untold stories here. So I'm not actually surprised that the Saudis and the Jordanians participated in this from an intelligence and defense standpoint, but from a political signaling to the world and their own population standpoint, they could have easily sat it out. And they obviously made a strategic decision not to. And I think that's important and helpful.
I think people don't understand the level of coordination required when you have 400 projectiles airborne at the same time, and you have hundreds of fighter jets and multi-layered air defense system all working jointly. You need unprecedented levels of coordination.
Yeah,
It's like a very delicate dance.
it's a great point. There is no possibility that defense against those 300 plus projectiles, which included, fighter bomber aircraft from at least 4 countries, guided missile destroyers on the part of the United States, other ships, I think, on the part of the UK, operating over the airspace of 4 or 5 different countries, all at the same time, with the Iron Dome and the Arrow and the Sling of David sling also operating at the same time, and not a single friendly fire incident. Unfortunately, there were a couple of deaths, but not because of anything the coalition forces did. No mishaps, no accidentally shooting down anyone else's plane, nothing like that. That does not happen. You don't gin that up in 5 minutes after the air raid sirens start to go off. That was completely pre-planned and coordinated, and it was pretty spectacular.
I want you to respond to a tweet I've seen. So we're going to remain respectful here. So we're not going to be calling names or anything like that. So this is a friendly podcast. But there's this commentator. We're not going to say anything about him, but just on the merits of the point.
Yeah.
A commentator by the name of Scott Ritter, who posted on X that the Iranians launched 7 hypersonic missiles that by design, that was the real target, and all of these 7 have penetrated, and that they've destroyed an Air Force base, and then Israel is defenseless. And I think people listen to him, but not to say nothing about him, but what you can Google him. I think you'll find a lot of interesting things. But
Yes.
what do you think about that comment, Brian?
Well, people can look at my X timeline and they'll see what I think of Scott Ritter and his opinion. But because it's a family show, I will keep it. I'll keep it a little more on the topic. So I think that's complete fiction. I think it is very much in line with Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, IRGC talking points. And usually, if you're getting your inspiration from Russian TV, that's probably not the most accurate way to get your thoughts. Look, if 7 hypersonic missiles had penetrated into the territory of Israel and struck targets of value, there's absolutely no chance that would be able to be hidden. The Russians have satellites above the Middle East. The Chinese have satellites above the Middle East. There's commercial satellites above the Middle East. That would be plastered all over international media right now if that had happened. And also I think the demeanor and the amount of deliberation by the Israeli war cabinet would be entirely different too if a couple Air Force bases had been taken out. I think that's pure fiction.
The thing with with the Western countries, and I would include the Israelis in that Western country definition, the way media operates in those countries, there's no media blackouts. Once something happens, it's not like Russia when you can just black out the whole thing, right? When something happens, which one person knows of, that's it. It's out in the open. It's out on Telegram, on X, on Instagram, on Facebook, and media gets a hold of it. So you can't hide these things if they happen.
Yes, exactly. And most military facilities, I don't know about the Israeli one, so I'm slightly speculating here, but I'm pretty confident. Most military facilities, even if they're secret in the sense that the world, the country doesn't advertise where they are, they're not just staffed by uniformed military personnel. They've got outside people that clean the bases. They've got outside people that do maintenance. They've got outside people. So there would be many, many, many phone cameras in all of those bases. And someone would have put it out. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, Tom, but when the United States got bin Laden in 2010, I guess it was, the world found out about it because the next door neighbor of where bin Laden was staying in Abbottabad, I think it was Abbottabad, put out on Twitter that he's seeing the helicopters come in. So I just think there's no way that that's a plausible theory.
I tend to agree with you just on the merits of how media works in Western countries.
Yeah.
Look, the Israelis still haven't kicked out Al Jazeera, by the way, which is insane to me.
I know.
Why keep them around? But hey, not my job, beyond my pay grade. So now we're going to dedicate the last 10 minutes of the show for questions from the audience.
Oh, great.
If you guys want to have a question for Brian, all you need to do is put a big Q before your comment and then ask the question, and I'll select the best questions. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. I'm going to select the best questions. I'm going to present them to Bryan. But we're right away. Don't get butthurt if we don't get all the questions. It's not going to happen. So the question number one is for me. I take the. I'm going to abuse my power as be the first question. So you understand media, you understand the law, you understand all these fields. So I'm going to ask you this question. Legally and from a PR standpoint, why did the Israelis have not kicked out Al Jazeera for 6 months since the war started? So from October 7th till now, Al Jazeera still operates freely in Israel. Why haven't they kicked out these guys? Clearly, what they've been doing is absolutely heinous.
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, it's important for us to flag things we don't know about. And I'm not an Israeli media expert. I'm not even sure what the laws are around media in Israel. Clearly, they have the authority to censor because they are doing that in the combat zones. I'm just going to guess that.
I mean, from a PR perspective, what's the play here?
It's right. So my guess is that it was twofold. One is Israel knew from the beginning that they were not going to get a fair shake by global media, and anything they did is going to be spun by propagandists on the other side. And so the story would have been, oh, you're kicking Al Jazeera out, obviously, because you're going to hide your massacres of civilians, which, to be clear to everybody, has never happened. But this would have been the claim. Also, there's some argument for having your friends close and your enemies closer. At least if Al Jazeera is pushing BS out from embedded units with the Israeli military, if they are, I don't know if they are, or
I don't
even
think they have embedded journalists at all, but but they're on the ground.
Well, the U.S. does. Maybe Israel doesn't, but the U.S. does for sure.
No, they have embedded journalists, but I have not seen a single report. I watch Al Jazeera religiously.
Oh, okay.
I have never seen an embedded journalist from Al Jazeera.
Okay, well, that would be smarter to not have them. But my point is, at least they could, at least the IDF media people could keep a close watch on them and maybe try to knock down some of the more ridiculous stories before they happen. I don't know. It's a mystery. I probably would have kicked them out, but
I would have kicked them also. Okay, so 2-0 to kick them out. Question number 2. I'm going to summarize the question. Roma is asking, will the U.S. join attack on Iran if Israel decides to retaliate?
I don't think so. And I don't think Israel wants the U.S. to join the attack on Iran because, first of all, Israel is completely capable of wreaking all kinds of havoc inside Iran without the U.S. And what you don't want, in my opinion, is to give evidence to back up the claim that the IRGC is going to make anyway, that Israel is America's puppet and they're too weak and they can't do this without America. And if just, wait till the U.S. Navy leaves and then we can do whatever we want. I think it would be a bad PR move to have the U.S. participate in that. Now, I will say, I believe that there will be the same sort of coordination in the sense that they'll deconflict their military operations so that the U.S. and the coalition will not get in Israel's way. And I'm sure there's also agreed upon tiers or I hate to say red lines where, if God forbid, I don't think this would ever happen, but, X percent of the Israeli attacking force gets destroyed and it actually looks like they might suffer some major damage, then I think the allies would come in. But I don't think it's in Israel's interest to have U.S. flagged F-35s flying over Tehran.
Yeah.
Just as a metaphor, I don't think anyone's going to be flying over Tehran.
Yeah, I agree with you. Great question here. What's Iran's next move? If you're like the mullah regime today, what are you doing? Stocking up on the tuna cans?
I'm in my bunkers for sure, and I might even be in Qatar at this point. I think they will correctly assume that Israel is not going to attack population centers and not going to try to attack the senior command and control in a way that would require them to hit population centers. So I don't think I'm sure they are in their bunkers, but I was kidding before. I don't think they've actually fled the country, although that's what the cowardly Hamas leaders did. But I think they're mostly working their diplomatic phones, I think, and working with their allies, Russia, China, et cetera, because I think they know this is going to happen. They're trying to figure out from a propaganda standpoint, how can we maximize the propaganda that we're going to put out on our side to make us look like the victims. It's a tricky thing for them, right? Because externally, they want to look like they're the victims of the Israeli oppressors. But internally, They don't want it to look like the Israelis kicked their ass. So excuse my language. So they got a very challenging PR problem of their own.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Another great question. I like the audience here. What's Qatar's role in this whole thing? Because Qatar has been very dominant in the Gaza part. Qatar is all of a sudden very silent about what's going on right now. So where do they stand on this in their double game?
Yeah, so I've actually gotten into some pretty heated debates with some of my colleagues who I usually agree with on the subject of Qatar. A lot of Americans are saying, "Why do we have a military base in Qatar? Why do we have a military base in Kuwait? If they're going to try to constrain what we're doing," which, by the way, I think that whole story was propaganda. The idea that Qatar or Kuwait told the U.S. we couldn't use our bases in those countries because they could tell us whatever they want, we're still going to do it. But there's a lot of people who are saying, get U.S. bases out of Qatar and Kuwait. They should be punished for their support of the Iranians and the regime in Iran and Hamas. And why are we pumping that money in their economy? I like the idea, Tom, that we have one gate between us and taking out the Qatari regime if we have to. I like the fact that we have military facilities stationed on their territory. Now, what I do think should happen to them after this is over is massive sanctions. And I think not just by the United States, but by their Arab neighbors. And I don't think that's far-fetched at all, because you'll recall that they were under sanctions, almost an economic blockade by the Saudis and the Emiratis for 4 or 5 years. And I think they need to be taken out of the center. They need to not be the trusted broker in negotiating with the bad guys. I'm sure we can find another country that we can have as a go-between. And then the last thing is, I think we should collectively, as the West, really consider more aggressive actions against Al Jazeera. I don't know what their licensing is in the United States, but I think that needs to be looked at.
Al Jazeera is a psyop. It's a psyop. The whole fucking thing is a psyop.
Of course. But we do have the First Amendment here, so I'm not sure how much we can do, but I think we should do something. I think Qatar. So look, Qatar on its own, as I understand it, you may know this more about this than I do. Qatar itself, in their physical country, they're not a big oil production energy country. They have made themselves.
Yeah,
they have natural gas. Yeah, but that's the other thing, is because it's natural gas and not oil, it's much easier for the West and the U.S. in particular to ramp up our production and supply and decrease their leverage internationally.
Going through the questions quick here, because we have a few more minutes left. You're doing great, Bryan. Lots of questions, but you're fielding everything. Another great question. I love this audience. I spoke about this many times. Iran is a very fractured country. There are lots of different factions, lots of different ethnicities, etc., etc. The one thing that joins all of them, the Baluchis, the Arabs, the Persians, they all fucking hate the regime.
Yeah.
So if all of these fractured ethnic factions hate the regime for the most part, is there a chance for an external force to help them topple the IRGC and the mullahs?
Yeah, I forgot to add this earlier, so I'm glad we got that question. I don't know what the target sets would be, but if there are targets that would not involve killing a lot of civilians that also would destabilize the regime, I personally would be in favor of that. I don't think that's U.S. policy, but I'm trying to think of a good example. A facility that makes, an oil refining facility would be a perfect example, because that's going to hurt the war effort, which makes it a legitimate military target, and it also will make the citizens less happy with their regime, I think. But on the broader question, I've gone back and forth on this. So in 2009, 2010, I was out of government when the Obama administration had the chance, I think, to really have supported covertly and overtly the resistance in Iran, which I think was quite serious at the time. And not only did we apparently not do that, but the president essentially came out on the international stage and said, we don't stand with this uprising. It wasn't quite as blunt as that, but it was pretty blunt. I thought that was a huge mistake. Since then, though, and I still think it was a mistake personally, but since then I've talked to a lot of Iranians, both that live in Iran and also that are out, because I did a big project on this a couple of years ago in LA. And they there's a big split of opinion about whether, just for the same reason we talked about the U.S. not being part of the military offensive strike against Iran, the regime wants the story always to be, this is the great Satan, the U.S., and the lesser Satan, Israel, messing with us, and therefore the people need to support us even more. So you don't want
Yeah.
to do anything that helps them further that narrative, but I'd be 100% for covert assistance, training, financing, maybe weapons. That's a little bit of a dicier proposition.
They already have a few militias operating there. Like the Balochis
Yeah,
have,
yeah.
they have their own stuff going on over there on the Pakistani border.
Yeah, and
The Azeris.
you've seen some acts of resistance which are pretty bold if you're living in Iran, like spray painting,
Yeah.
pro-Israel slogans and refusing to step on the Israeli flag while you go into a building. So
Every
they're
Iranian I
brave.
spoke to outside of Iran were super pro-Israelis.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's insane.
Yeah,
That was the
yeah.
most shocking thing. So another good question for you, right up your alley. So yesterday, Biden was saying we're not going to allow Israel to retaliate, et cetera, or at least his people were saying. Now they're saying, okay, we're going to allow something that's contained that we can live with. So what
So
changed?
they never said. I defy anyone
Cool.
to find a quote where President Biden or anyone else in the administration said we will not permit
Now that I
Israel
think
to
of it, you're
retaliate.
right. I only heard analysis, not a direct quote. You're right.
And there was this, I think, not entirely accurate, completely unsourced story that Biden had told Netanyahu in a phone call that they can't do anything offensively. First of all, you don't tell Israel they can't do something. There's no chance Biden had that conversation. But whatever the conversation was, yesterday on 2 or 3 different internationally televised talk shows, John Kirby, Admiral Kirby, who I believe, if you want to know what the U.S. government is actually going to do, as opposed to leaks from campaign staffers or off the cuff remarks that the president makes at a closed fundraiser, watch what John Kirby says. Because one, I think he's a very credible guy, but also as the National Security Council spokesman, he won't say anything until the entire government has come together and approved it. And what he said twice yesterday, I watched very carefully for this on the Sunday shows, is almost in these words. The U.S. recognizes that Benjamin Netanyahu is the elected representative of the Israeli people, and we are not going to get into the business of telling Israel what they can and cannot do militarily, full stop, said it twice. Now, he then did go on to say that it's U.S. policy to try to do everything possible to avoid a wider regional war, which, as far as I'm concerned, is just the adult thing to do if you're a nuclear power. But I think all this talk of, us, the U.S., trying to stop Israel is complete BS. I don't think we could stop them if we wanted to, and I don't actually think we want to.
Well, the problem is that you're right. It's not. It's the world's most undisciplined proxy. But the problem is that I come from economics and finance.
Yeah.
So everybody's right now trying to get inflation down, and it's been tough getting it down from 4% to 2%. The first from 9 to 4 it was easy. The last 2% is tough. Like in losing weight, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
So everybody's fighting, and the main push, the main component of CPI is energy and shelter, right? So shelter is sticky, but energy is like super volatile. So if a regional war happens, if Israelis start something that ends up being a massive regional war, that's gonna destroy whatever economic platform the Biden administration had to present in November to voters, because they would like to come in November and say, hey, we brought inflation down from 9% to 2.7% or to 3%, right? If oil spikes because of what the Israelis do, in November, the DNC basically has to deal with higher inflation. The Fed pivots, raises rates again. Everybody's up in arms. They're going to lose that election because nobody has won an election when the economy was worse. It's very tough. So I'm assuming there's going to be levers pulled and pressures applied to prevent anything that makes this scenario into reality. But I don't think, I agree with you. I don't think they can just say, hey, no. But there's still pressure points that they can apply to basically contain the situation. So
So I would say a couple things about that. One is, I guess I'm cynical about most things, but I've never believed, I didn't believe this when I worked for Reagan or Clinton or Bush 43, and I don't believe it about Biden. Trump, I don't know. That's another story. But what I would call a normal presidency, okay, a historically normal presidency, I really don't think that American presidents make decisions about putting American soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen in harm's way based on election considerations. I hope that's not true. I know it wasn't true under Clinton and George W. Bush, and I could give you
Mm.
examples of how I know that. So that's thing one. Thing two, though, is I'm
Well, if
not
anybody
even
knows this, you've been inside the building. So I
yeah.
haven't been. Nobody in the chat have been, and 99.99% of the people who comment online have not been inside the fucking building. Sorry, just to demonetize the
Yeah,
stream.
but and next time I'll give you examples under both those presidencies. But the more important point I think is, yes, American elections oftentimes are won or lost on economics, but also it's very, very hard for a president who is in the middle of a global shooting war to get defeated. And in
Mm,
fact, that's such a truism that there's a whole
mm,
slang saying about it in the United States, wag the dog. Everyone thought that when
mm,
Clinton was being impeached, he was going to launch a war to distract the people so he would win re-election.
mm.
So I don't I don't know how that would weigh out, but if the US and Israel and the Saudis and the Emiratis were fighting an actual war on one side and you had the Iranians and their proxies on the other side, I don't think that hurts Biden's reelection chances.
That's a great answer. Wartime rally behind the flag is a thing. You're right. It's a good point.
Yeah.
And also, you've been in the fucking building, so we're already demonetized. So that's why I also appreciate this donation by PI. The $5 is going to be the only money from the stream. So thank you for that. I really appreciate that. That's really interesting because I haven't thought about rally behind the flag kind of situation. You're right. That counterweights that argument. So PI is just donated coffee for me, and thank you, PI. PI, what you've asked, we discussed in the beginning of the stream. So just to give you the bottom line, since you donated some money, and I appreciate that, is that we basically said that we don't know since it's the Middle East, nobody knows for sure. But if you want analysis, it can happen, and we talked about possible outcomes: full-blown Israeli strike on Iran, or some sort of a contained strike, or nothing at all. So all these options, and we don't know. So it's
I would say again, being humble, which we should be because no one knows, but I
nobody
think
knows.
it's almost inconceivable that Israel doesn't have a military response. The
That's
question is
yeah.
when and how serious it'll be.
Especially after they said today that they will respond and harshly.
Yeah, you can't, especially in that neighborhood, you
Yeah.
can't bluff.
Yeah. I wish we had a DeLorean and 1.21 gigawatts.
Yeah.
Or at
Would
least
you
a
would
Mr.
you would
Fusion with some bananas.
would you go back and buy more Palantir when it was $6 if you had a time machine?
I would have gone back 50 years ago and bought up everything.
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, definitely. So I want to first of all give a huge shout out to PI for that really cool donation. I'm going to ask you one more question, which I saw in the chat, and I don't want to miss this question, even though I already
Sure.
lost the highlight. I want to give a shout out to Rajeshkar Gudapati. Sorry for butchering your name, buddy, for becoming a channel member. I appreciate it. Still
Nice.
2,000 people in the stream. Nobody is left, which is actually
Amazing.
insane. So we had a question. In the chat earlier, and I'm sorry for not pulling up your question because I've lost it in the comments. But somebody has asked a really good question, and we're going to finalize the show with this question. Is this right now the final chance of the Israelis to stop the Iranians from getting to a nuke? I think it was a phenomenal question.
Yes, it is a great question. I'm just writing down a little shameless plug I'm going to do before we go.
Of course. Whoever asked this question, can you re-ask it so I can put it on the screen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that is no. And the reason I think the answer to that is no is, first of all, there's still uncertainty about where exactly Iran is in the process of developing nuclear weapons. We certainly know they're trying. And I explained earlier why I think the combination of the Obama, Trump, and Biden decisions on this actually made it much worse combined together. But we just don't know. And I also think that the mix of weapons and tactics that you would have to use to meaningfully damage their nuclear program is entirely different than what I think they're going to use to do some of the strategic deterrence strikes that they got to do over the next couple of days. But you can't entirely rule it out. You know, there's a logic to it, right? Is that they're never going to be seen as justified as they are now. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think it's unlikely. I certainly don't think that the deterrence strikes we were talking about earlier and a strike on their nuclear facilities would all come at the same time. I think that's just way too complicated and way too risky of human life, and I don't think they'll do it.
So here's the question. So Rex has claimed it to be his question, which I put up on the screen because it was an honor code. And then we have the actual person to just retype the question. So Rex, you naughty. We did it based on honor. So don't do it again. Next time you're going to time out. So 686, thank you for this question. I think it was a phenomenal question. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. I also want to give a shout out to Aquila Horner for the love you, Tom. Thank you for the $35. I want to give a shout out also to Amir for joining as a channel member. Really appreciate that as well. Thank you. And Danny for also joining as a channel member. And to the 1,862 viewers who stay with us for a whole hour, which is to me unprecedented on this channel. I really appreciate it. Now, Bryan, can you please shamelessly plug yourself? And before you do, one more, Roxana Cabrera. I don't know what a pen is, but thank you for for whatever that is. If it's a coffee, that's exactly what I need. And thank you so much for that kind donation.
Do you want me to answer that question? Well, it's a statement. Hope. She says, "Hope you are not seeing the beginning of World War III." So I actually do want to comment on that if you don't mind. So
if you have time,
yeah. So you guys, I'm sure if people that follow me saw me post this yesterday, I did a space yesterday where I talked a lot about this. I think that, not talking about Roxana here because she's making a hopeful statement, but a lot of people, as the Iranian attacks were happening, were just going crazy on social media about World War III. And I think that is extremely irresponsible and dangerous to do, especially in the middle of an attack like that. I personally think actually that we may be already in the early stages of another world war, but not because of this. I think it started when Russia got away with their first annexation in Ukraine. And I think
2014.
Yeah. And you always, historians always have to write through hindsight, right? So we don't know. But if we wind up the West having to fight Russia, China, Iran, North Korea later in this century, I think historians will date it to when Russia went into Ukraine in 2014. And here's my shameless plug. It's very high tech. It's the...
Hold on, I'm going to put you on the screen. So a few things here. I'm going to put you on the screen and a few things. Number one, before you do the shameless plug, Twitter, X, whatever you call it, I'm telling you right now, there's 1,800 people here. Go follow this guy. You're not doing him a favor, you're doing yourself a favor. He has become my go-to on Twitter Spaces. I listen to them religiously. They're good. He has good people on there. He's assertive and yet still kind, and I fuck with those a lot. So go follow him on Twitter, and he debunks a lot of the anti-Israeli bullshit with ease. So please follow Bryan for your own sake, and thank me later. But you also do a podcast, which I will be a guest on. So let's do that.
Yes, you will. Yeah, here's my high tech. It's the hiddenhistoryhappyhour.com. And we talked about this a little bit last time, Tom. What we do is, I actually have an update. So my co-host on this Hidden History Happy Hour is a British Tory politician. I guess that's the only kind of Tory politician. And he now is the official nominee of the Tory party for Margaret Thatcher's old Parliament seat. So he may be in Parliament by the time the year's out. But meanwhile, what we do is we tell obscure stories from history, either stories about a famous battle that you didn't know about, or something that you've never heard of, like Abraham Lincoln being in a duel when he was there. It is. Thank you. Yes. Hidden History Happy Hour. And it's a good time because while we tell the story, we drink what we think the characters in our story would have been drinking. So by about the third story in a podcast, it gets interesting. And I welcome all the new followers that want to join up and also anybody that wants to check out the show. It's fun. And
And
we will have
and I'm
Tom
gonna be
on
the next
soon.
guest. I'm gonna be the next guest, right?
Yeah, we gotta talk on offline about your stories, but yes, we'll
I want to
definitely
do
have you on
something that
soon.
has to do with Chernobyl because I'm obsessed with Chernobyl accident. I've read all the
Well,
books. I know everything. The name. I'm obsessed because it happened when I was a kid. So like, it's my childhood trauma is Chernobyl.
let's
So
do that
I'm obsessed
because
about it.
I have a personal involvement in the CIA's activities after Chernobyl that we can talk about.
Yeah, we
That's
should.
how much older than you I am.
Not that much older. Not that much older.
I was very
So,
young at the time, I will say.
an inside joke from Mustard. Upcoming Nash video with "It's over" in the thumbnail. You know it. It's either "It's over" or "This is bad." The algorithm.
Your fans have your number, Tom.
They know it's a joke. I want to thank number one to all the moderators in the chat for keeping it clean. I want to thank Bryan for coming on here and dropping some truth bombs, some knowledge bombs, and I want to thank the audience. And this is part 2 or part 3. Is this part 3 already?
Part
Have we
3,
done?
part 3, yeah.
So if you guys want part 4, you need to like up the stream. You need to share it. So if it gets absolutely viral, then we'll do part 4. So you guys drive the bus and you
Beautiful.
decide. And thank you, everybody. We're out. Peace.
Great. Thank